a psychotherapist, a somatic experiencing practitioner, a trauma specialist, and host of the Transcending Trauma podcast. She works in private practice and is a teaching assistant at the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, founded by Dr. Peter Levine. She has worked in the field of mental health, personal development, and trauma for over 15 years and is a passionate social entrepreneur and change maker. Please welcome Monica Spiteri.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So, today I am going to be talking about mental health and podcasting. Podcasting, as you've heard from everybody, it's booming. And as a mental health professional, I've chosen to add podcasting to my suite of offerings to reach a lot more people around the world and giving them access to lived experience, stories from people that have gone through mental health issues and that have actually come through the other side, and especially trauma. And so what we're going to do today is just discuss ways of creating a safe space when dealing with topics around mental health and trauma through podcasting. As you would have heard from a lot of the other speakers, it's about finding a niche, trying to find something to present on. And I suppose where I'm coming from with this presentation is making sure that you choose topics that are relevant and that you can basically hold your own in when being able to sort of discuss it. So as you would have heard in my bio, I'm the host of the Transcending Trauma podcast. I'm also a qualified trauma specialist, so I do have a private practice in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm a social entrepreneur and change maker. I'm also the president and founder of a newly emerging social enterprise called Envico Health, where we'll be looking to establish a trauma recovery centre for people to come and reside. And it's quite sort of revolutionary in the mental health sector. Apart from being a teaching assistant, with the Trauma Institute, I have built my podcast very much around my private practice and around my brand as a therapist and specialist in the field. And so, like you would have heard from the other speakers, setting the tone of your brand is really important. So what is your podcast's purpose? Why are you doing it? What is your podcast's message, and what is the category that you're going to be going into? And who is the audience? So creating that avatar, who are the people that you want listening to your show? Are they male? Are they female? Is it what age demographic? If you can get a picture of your ideal audience or the person that you're going to be speaking to, it will help you to build your brand around your podcast. Also start looking at who your competitors are. As we know, podcasting is growing, and because of COVID, everybody seemed to jump on the podcasting bandwagon. And so you want to know who are your competitors. What makes your podcast different from all the hundreds of others that are out there? And what makes you an authority on the topic? Because this is really important, knowing how to position yourself in that space, in the topic and the category that you're choosing to speak in. And so then it comes down to your voice branding as well. So there's 3 types of relationships that we focus on when we're speaking. So the relationship that we have with ourselves, are you confident? Are you comfortable talking about the topic that you're presenting on or that you're building your show around? The relationship we have with that content and the relationship we hold with the listeners, because that's really important. And understanding, like you would have heard from the other speakers, that, having the right setup, having really good equipment, you want to be able to capture the audience from the very beginning of your podcast, and you want to be able to hold their attention. So if you don't have good quality equipment, if you're in an environment that has a lot of distraction, sometimes listeners will tune out, and you need to be able to keep reinventing your brand, knowing how you can expand your brand, how you can expand the show, how it can keep people interested. And so really looking at that relationships, and how do you keep those relationships fresh, and then how do you start building that into your suite and into your offerings. As a mental health professional, I take duty of care really important when you're talking about sensitive issues. So depression, trauma, mental health issues, they're one of the most common illnesses in society. It affects people in the workforce, it affects relationships. And so when discussing topics that are really sensitive, it is important not to re-traumatize your guest or the listeners, and this is what is called vicarious trauma. So going for the shock value to make yourself or your show sound edgy or sound cool can actually do harm to the audience and to the guest. So if you're not qualified at discussing or holding a space for a guest, then I would suggest avoiding creating a show about it because you feel it's an on-trend topic, or you think that it will be something that people want to listen to. That can actually be really quite detrimental to your guest. I've listened to quite a few podcasts. Being in the mental health space, I've had different people approach me to be on their podcasts as well. And I actually really do quite a bit of due diligence before having people on my show. It's important for me to retain my brand quality, and I make sure that people that are coming on my show know what they're talking about. They actually have the credentials and the qualifications to be talking about the topic. And especially with people that have been through trauma or have had a lived experience, when you're a host of a podcast and people are sharing their stories, you need to be able to look for the signs that they may be becoming re-triggered, they may be becoming upset, because you don't ever want to unpack things that you don't have the skill set to be able to hold for that person. When you have listeners also talking about the content, I make sure that I have trigger warnings either at the beginning of the show or at the end of the show. I encourage people to reach out to their support networks, to reach out, to their crisis support lines as well. I think the worst thing that I ever heard somebody say on a podcast while interviewing a guest that was sharing quite a horrific trauma history was the podcast host actually said that people listening to this podcast may suicide. And that is, in my book, completely unethical as a podcast host. I don't believe that anybody should be listening to a podcast and then suiciding because of the content that they've listened to. So as a podcast host, I take duty of care seriously. I take it seriously as a practitioner. And that is why when you're reaching a mass audience, that you as a host take your show seriously. So as much as you're tempted to sit here and go, okay, I want to start a podcast, and mental health is very common and very prevalent, so is some of the topics of trauma at the moment, whether we're looking at major impact traumas, or we're talking about sexual abuse and things like that, that seems to be very common around the world at the moment. You need to know that you have the qualifications and the ability to be able to hold those conversations and really take care of your guests. So their mental health and well-being is your responsibility while you're being a podcast host. And so that is knowing your subject matter. So when you're also reaching out to guests, or that you have those guests coming to be on your show, you need to be able to hold that conversation on the topic. There's been quite a few podcasts that I've listened to, and if you can't keep up with your guest as a host, then it shows that you either haven't done your research in regards to the subject matter, or you haven't done research on who your guest is that you're holding a space for. So if you're holding somebody that's just, holding a space for somebody to share that they've just written a book about their traumatic history, or they're overcoming their adversities, or if they've produced a movie, you really want to be either reading the book, watching the movie, checking out their profiles, spending some time researching who this guest is that you're actually who's coming on your show. You need to be able to dive deep into those conversations with them. You need to be able to hold your own on the subject matter and be able to lead those conversations. My Transcending Trauma podcast is very much a conversational style. There are other styles that you would have heard through the different presenters today. Sometimes people like to have a long list of questions. That's not my style. I find that to be quite rigid. I like the conversations to be quite natural and free flowing. But if that's not your style and you don't feel comfortable doing that, then starting off with a podcast that has a little bit more structure to it, where you may have a list of questions which you can sort of work your way through, maybe what you need to do just to start off with. I know, listening to my very first podcast to the podcast that I'm doing now, I've heard my voice has changed. I'm a lot more confident, a lot more comfortable talking with my guests, and that actually starts to show. So you will find your own rhythm. You will find that sometimes you don't need to be that rigid. I allow an hour for my podcasts, but sometimes I might finish at half an hour. Sometimes I might finish at 45 minutes. Sometimes the conversation is so good that we will go for more than an hour, and then I will split it up into a 2-part series. I will be able to then use that content later as well. So it's just, knowing your subject matter, reaching out to those guests, being able to hold the conversations, be really confident in what it is that you want to be presenting about, what you want to be talking about, and then really sort of hone in on that niche, just really perfect it, sort of choose something, stick to it, and then just keep working on it. Mental health checks. So I also check with a guest if there's anything that they don't want to talk about. This is using what would be called a trauma-informed approach. So, there's a lot of information out there on the internet. So if you just look up trauma-informed care, trauma-informed approach, motivational interviewing styles, there's a lot of information out there that you can use in regards to how you frame your podcast when talking about mental health issues. It is really important that you check with a guest if they don't want to talk about it. I always take a little bit of time before I start recording with a potential guest just to check in with them, get a little bit of a framework before I start recording in regards to what they would like to talk about, what they don't want to talk about, and just making a mental note of that. There is nothing worse than blindsiding your guest with something that they were not comfortable with. It's unprofessional. Short stories, it's really unprofessional. So also check with yourself how comfortable you are talking and discussing the topic. If in doubt, don't. It's just a rule. If you don't feel confident and comfortable talking about the subject matter, it will come through in the recording. It will come through, and it will just, the conversations just won't flow. There'll be, there's a bit of a vibe that sort of happens between you and the guest. So avoid it. If it's a subject, or if it's anything to do with mental health or trauma, and you're not comfortable delving into those quite raw materials sometimes, then just avoid it. Choose a different subject matter. I check in with my guests after the show, or I spend a little bit of time with them debriefing. So I debrief with the guest after the recording is finished, just in case that there is anything that has re-triggered them that they may be sitting with. Being a trauma therapist, I do have that added advantage of being able to see the signs while I'm working with somebody or speaking with somebody. I can sort of see if there's a little bit of activation in them and that they may be getting a little bit uncomfortable or something from their history is coming up. Because when you're talking about traumatic events, these are things that have happened in the past. So, of course, when a person is going to be telling their story, and people want to tell their stories, and people at the moment really want to hear from the lived experience. And that is what my brand is all about. It's about talking to people that have overcome traumas, that have lived through adversity, that have made it through to the other side. Most of the people that I have on as guests have turned their lives around. And even though their childhoods or their upbringings have been extremely traumatic, they have now led very successful lives. They've become very successful coaches, trainers, authors, film producers, the list goes on. And that's the type of story. They're the type of people that I love talking to. And I often get emails from my guests after they've been on the show just to let me know how safe they felt. Sometimes they feel like it's a little bit of a therapy session when they do come on my show. They know that they are in good hands. And so, as you would have heard from a lot of the other presenters, that is how you're positioning yourself as an authority. Why are people wanting to come on your show as a guest? What makes you different? What makes you an authority? If you have no skills or qualifications in mental health or trauma, then I would avoid creating a podcast around that, because people want to know that they are in good hands, especially with these topics. Of course, if you're somebody who has been through trauma or you've had that lived experience, then definitely you can shape a podcast around the lived experience. The peer-led movement globally, across the world, you will have many community sectors that have a peer-led movement or a consumer movement. People that have used mental health services, that have used health services. You could look at a whole list of health, whether it's people that have been through cancer and overcome it, people that are into natural health. If you find topics that interest you, find a topic that is something that you feel comfortable about, something that you actually like, and then be able to niche down on that. And so, it's really important that, when we're talking about these mental health issues or trauma, that I actually sort of unpack and spend a little bit of time with my guests. I've managed to meet some amazing people from around the world, and we do, we keep in contact. And that's what I think is so fantastic about podcasting, is that you get to talk to people on a global scale. You get to talk about, amazing topics. And people just want to have a story to tell, and you can really create that for them. So, presenting with purpose and how to promote yourself and your business through your podcast. And this is something that I've managed to do. I've recently relaunched my website. I have my podcasts now coming through my website. So it's about funneling down, having my podcasts on my website, having my online programs, having something people can download. So creating that marketing mailing list is really important. There's plenty of platforms out there. There's Patreon, there's Facebook. It just depends on what you want to do in regards to your time, which, we've heard from different presenters. Becoming a podcast host is time consuming. I bring out a podcast once a week, and you need to be able to build that in. I also do, I design tiles. I do quite a little bit of marketing. I present a package to my guests. So they get a podcast tile with the episode. I do a little headline or audiogram, so then people can use that on their social media. And so I give them a little media kit and a promotion kit that I actually supply to my guests. So you've got to factor into all these things, not only for your own marketing, but it's also about that brand building and then working out how you can do a collaboration as well. So they're coming onto your podcast because they want promotion, but we're also using their channels to promote yourself. And so I love creating win-win situations for my guests. So looking at, the audience hook, the podcast must start with a hook. A great method is a snippet from the show that is going to grab people's attention and makes them want to stick around and listen to it. So that's what's really good about the headliners. So you create a little 1-minute audio, which can be used across all the social medias, perfect for Instagram. I sit there and I listen to my interviews. At first when I started, it was a little bit uncomfortable and I didn't like doing it. But then after a while, as soon as it's up there and it's produced, all the audio files are together, I sit there and I listen to it. And then what I do is find a really good, catchy 1-minute audiogram, and then I put that into an audiogram and then put that through the social media networks, and then have the links there for people. If they really like what they've heard, they will grab onto that and then they'll listen to the full episode. Find a solution. Your podcast must deliver a solution from the very start to make sure that they stick around to the end of the show, especially with podcasts that are service-based like myself. If I'm talking about mental health and I'm talking about trauma, my avatar or my audience wants to come there for a solution. These are people that possibly will be listening to the podcast for the very first time, or they may be a long-term listener and they've listened to a whole series of my podcasts. They may be a person that is just looking for some support and for some help. It's the first time that they've realized that they may have some unresolved trauma or some mental health issues. They may have a family member or a friend or a loved one that is going through a tough time. And a lot of my clients now subscribe to my podcast. So it's a way that I look to promoting my business on a global scale. And then I'm hoping that, not everybody can afford therapy. And so, and depending on what country you live in, you may not have good mental health support services. So I look at my podcast as a way of being able to promote to the masses. And if somebody can take something away from my podcast that has helped them, has possibly saved a life, has allowed that person to think about getting into therapy, then for me, that's the solution. My podcast has delivered and solved a problem for that person. And so look at the ideas, look at the main ideas that are going to be discussed on the show, ones that really motivate the listener to keep coming back, keep listening. You want people to subscribe and download your podcast. And of course, planting a seed for that call to action for your business must be at the end of the podcast. Once you've captured those listeners, you want to filter them in and bring them down into your business. And that can be a service-based business. Be a guest on other people's shows. So one thing that I've found now that I've launched my podcast, I am being invited onto guests. I'm being invited onto shows and summits like this. So create a Media One sheet, and there's lots of Media One sheet templates out there. Google is your best friend here. And you create that Media One sheet. People don't have a lot of time to read a lengthy bio. So a Media One sheet usually has a profile shot of you. It'll have, a section that you can have your topics that you like to talk about. It has all your social media links in there, and it just has a few lines, a couple of short, sharp sentences in regards to your bio, because people are time poor. So if they can just have a 1-minute sheet, they can see who you are, they can check out your links, they have a good little bio to introduce you. It makes everybody's job a lot easier, and it raises your brand profile as well. So find ways to collaborate with people that have similar shows or similar interests. Then you can have a really good mixing pot and can create some really rich shows for people. So if you'd like to connect with me, here are all my social media links and my website. I will be in the Hop On room. So I really hope that you've got something out of my presentation today when it comes to, choosing topics that can be a little bit tricky. And I think that, all these guests have given you some real gems, and we're all here to support you, answer any questions. So jump on over to the next room. If you have any questions, I'll connect with you over there. So thank you.